But some of my memories, these are interesting in the fact that they go back to probably around 1968 for me. A friend of mine who happened to be my best friend at my wedding, but we were classmates, and he came to my house. We used to ride dirt bikes together, and my dad had this trash can full of stuff, and he said, Dan, you can take whatever you want. So he went out to the trash can and pulled out a bunch of still drawings and then these cellular art from It's a Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, and he kept them. And I told him, I said, well, you should frame them up and maybe clean them up. And he put them in his house and left them there for years and years and years. And it wasn't until the Schulz Museum opened up that he called me one night and said, Craig, I have these cell art things, and I really think they belong in the museum as opposed to my house. And they're really almost invaluable, to find these things these days. Everybody sells stuff like that. And he donated these cells that were done by Bill Melendez back in, 65, 66. And it was wonderful for him to do that, and it was a great asset to the museum. So here we have, again, a background scene with the characters coming in, iconic scene, Charlie Brown with all the holes cut in because he wasn't the best at making costumes. From the opening sequence where Linus is rolling the pumpkin in the house, that's right from the opening sequence. This classic sequence here where Lucy's going to die for apples and comes up with a Snoopy. They're all great scenes, and again, here they're getting ready to go out trick-or-treating, and Linus, I think, is struggling to get his costume on, but brings back a lot of memories. It was fun to see how these things are made as opposed to, we did the Peanuts movie, all done on computers, totally different way of doing things. These are all hand-drawn, hand-painted by some great artists down in LA. It's pretty special. Yeah, well, they used to throw away, thousands of these things. A typical movie might have, well over 1,000 frames, and each frame, has a different item put on it. For example, you might have one cell that has a mouth, another cell has a background, another cell has a character, and then they have to move those things, 24, well, in Bill's case, they did 12 frames a second. So they'd move them 12 times in each second to create these movies. And when they were done, they would just throw them in the dumpsters behind the building there. And if you were savvy enough back then, you would have gone and dug it all out. But nobody did. And Disney did the same thing. So it wasn't until later on when everybody started collecting stuff that they became really valuable. And now people are hunting them down, or they're recreating them. They're relatively easy to recreate. But to find originals like this that have been sitting there in somebody's house for 35, 40 years, and not finding somebody that wants to sell them and cash in on it is pretty special, I think. And Lucky's a friend of mine, and he appreciated where they belonged. And it's nice to let other people see them. You look at them yourself. It's not the same thing as letting the world come in and see them. And people that come here are true Peanuts fans, and this stuff is really special to see. This is really the history of kind of where it all took off at. Charlie Brown Christmas and Pumpkin Show are really the two biggies. I mean, he had a couple of those strips he worked on before, Little Folks he did. And as he was building up his portfolio to take to it, and he worked at the art instruction school, where he was surrounded by artists that did all sorts of things, from paintings to different things. So I think on a continuous basis, he would come up with ideas for comic strips and characters and so forth, and show them around to his peers and get their feedback on whether they liked them or didn't like them, what they could work on. And then they did that vice versa. They all kind of fed off each other, because they're all young, up and coming artists and so forth. So they did that, and I think Peanuts was by no means a huge success when it started. Started in 7 papers. It took a few years to really get the thing rolling. People, now that it's become so big and it's worldwide and everybody on the planet knows Charlie Brown and Snoopy, they don't realize it was a tough start, as is, a lot of TV shows that really rocket to start up. The first Seinfeld, for example, wasn't a hit in the beginning, and Peanuts was the same way. So it's interesting. I think the timing for him, he was very lucky, I think, in timing, as there are a lot of people in life. They come through and they just happen to be born in the right era at the right time, and then they hit on target. And I think his was an example of that. I don't know that Peanuts would have taken off as well in 2016 as it did in 1950, or if it had started in 1930. You don't really know. But he definitely hit the sweet spot of American culture at the right time. I think that's really the key to success. 50 years of doing comic strips, almost 18,000 of them, and he lettered and drew every single one of those. Had no help, and he literally wouldn't take advice from anybody. If you gave him an idea, he wouldn't use it. He wouldn't let anybody letter it or draw. He did have helpers come in the 1950s. We moved out to California in 1958, and again, he was just starting out, and there was no guarantee Peanuts was going to take off or last, by any means. So he brought out some collaborators. They worked on Peanuts comic books together, and they worked on other comic strips. They had one of teenagers called It's Only a Game, and they dealt with sports, and he tried that for a while and different things. And then I think by the early 1960s, Peanuts had already started coming of age, and then the animation came out in the Ford commercials, and then by 1965, when Charlie Brown Christmas came out, it just skyrocketed all different levels. And by 1968, it was one of the most popular strips on the planet. When that show was made, they did it in 6 months or something like that. It's incredible how fast they put it together. The CBS executives looked at it. They all hated it. They thought we're never going to make money on this show. We probably shouldn't even air it, but they already had the time slot, so they had to put it on the air. And he tells a funny story that the show aired, and they got like 48 shares, so half the country watched it. And he called Lee up and he said, "Well, I just want you to know, my wife didn't like it either." So it was sort of funny that he stood by the thing that he didn't think it was going to be a success. And then it was so successful, they called back, later on, they said, "We need 5 more blockbusters." And therefore, then came out, The Great Pumpkin Show and Thanksgiving and some of the others. But a lot of people don't realize there was a lot of shows done before and after that. There was one in between The Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown's All-Stars, and then they've done over 50 animated specials. People say, "Oh, I see all the Charlie Brown specials." They keep thinking of the big 3, but there's really over 50 of them they did. And then they did live action. They did a lot of cutting edge shows that people either have not got to see because they're not really released anymore, or just never saw in the first place. Well, I think what's interesting too is you can look back either through the comic strips, or I think the Christmas special is a good example of how my dad looked at society around him. And you go back to, again, 1965, and he thought Christmas was too commercialized back then, which is almost laughable now because you compare it to now, where Christmas comes out in the middle of summertime. We're already having Christmas trees go up and so forth. And there's just so many examples of that throughout the comic strip that he was, so far ahead of his time, was looking at where society was going and where he thought, we were going astray, I guess, you would say. And then the way he just delivered the message, he was really adamant on having the message of Christmas in there, and putting the lines from the Bible in there, and using kids' voices, and not having he hated laugh tracks. So they broke ground on so many different levels in that special. It really wasn't recognized until years later when people look back and start critiquing that show. Yeah, again, I'm not sure they thought that any of them were going to be really big. Obviously the Christmas was a success, but remember in those days there was only 3 channels, so your choices weren't as widespread as they are today. And so they were getting almost a 50% share on those shows. But for me it was interesting because when Christmas came out, for example, up until then, everybody read the comic strip and no one had heard the voices of the characters. So the first time I heard that show on TV, I was kind of shocked. So I'm going, that's not what Charlie Brown sounds like. And boy, Lucy doesn't sound right, because in your mind you've sub-vocalized the text you've been reading for 13 years. And by the time Pumpkin came out, you were used to the voices by then. We've been through the All-Stars, and you'd seen Christmas a couple times, and the Ford commercials would come out, and all of a sudden you start saying, okay, that's what they sound like. And then Lee was getting good at casting the same kids from different classrooms, and a typical kid might last through 2 or 3 shows, and then you had to find a kid that just sounded like that other kid. But so now the voices are iconic, and you can't go off the voices at all, or people go, well, that's terrible. Snoopy didn't sound like he was, and Charlie Brown and Lucy don't sound right. So it becomes very critical. But it was interesting in the early days because everybody was so sensitive to those voices and what they were all saying. For me, that was what was interesting as a kid. Yeah, there's a funny story where my dad and Bill and Lee were working on it, and my dad said, wouldn't it be great if we could make Snoopy fly? And Lee's going, I am an animator. I can make Snoopy fly. And they never thought about it. And so Bill went back and put those scenes together, Snoopy flying, which were they're just fantastic. And that was my inspiration really for doing the Peanuts movie, was simply those flying scenes they had done in that film. Was so great to see Snoopy fly and go into his imagination. And we took that one step further in the Peanuts movie, because you really get to go into Snoopy's mind and see really what he's thinking, as opposed to just seeing him fly. Now you realize what he's thinking about and what motivates him to fly, and those sort of things. That was fun for us to do in that film. I think the colors in that film were much more vivid than they were in Christmas. Christmas was much more muted down. I think people liked the look of Pumpkin much greater. As on a funny side note, I had, when my nephew was growing up, we'd go out trick-or-treating with him every year. And I always find a rock, and I would slip it in his bag every year from when he was like 5 years old till he was like 16. He could never figure out where that rock came from for like 10 years. Because I get a rock, every year I get a rock. Where's this rock coming from? And finally someone spilled the beans and said, well, Craig's been putting them in your bag for the last 10 years. He was fanatical about making sure everything was authentic. He really didn't want to offend anybody that really knew the subject material he was dealing with. And if you ever went into his room and saw his library of books, whether it be on ophthalmology or war or tennis or whatever, he made sure that he wasn't going to offend the people that really knew that subject material. And again, he was, in World War II and so forth. So when you look at the scenery and you actually see some of the signs that Snoopy walks by, they're authentic to the area and to the period when that was taking place. And so he made sure that would always be that way. And, we tried to do the same thing in our film, and a lot of it got taken down by the executives and like doing that anymore. But, he had total control and total say or whatever he did, so it was kind of easier for him to do films than it is these days for us to do them. But yeah, that was the way he did things. Well, no, I mean, I was 13, 14 years old, and I remember seeing the original script for Christmas, which was like 4 pages of just handwritten notes, and then, Bill had made notes on top of that, and so forth. And I never have seen the script for Pumpkin. Well, I know they didn't have like we do now, where you're in a computer and you're scripting the whole thing out, scene by scene, as I'm sure he's written just handwritten notes and so forth, and developed it into a story. I think the interesting aspect is, again, the way he would look at a subject and just from a certain angle change it around. And the whole story of The Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, just simply came about of my dad thinking, well, what if a kid got the holidays mixed up? It's easy to think about that. And he had 5 kids, so he got to see some of all the dumb things we did as kids. It'd be easy to look at a kid and say, what if they just got these things confused and all of a sudden thought this was Christmas and, this thing's going to bring presents, and then it evolved into this thing here. And it became, the Great Pumpkin, and Great Pumpkin's going to bring presents to this poor kid that's mixed up, and all he's got to do is go out in the field and create this. So he kind of built on that theme, but it was a very simple little idea. And I think so many of his ideas were that way, where you can look back and try to deconstruct them and think that he had this whole plan of, I'm going to do this and it'll work this way and eventually it'll become really great. But they weren't. They were very just small little nuggets of an idea that they just kind of grew over time. And then he got to use them over and over again. I mean, I think he always said one of his greatest things he ever came up with was, again, Snoopy's a flying ace. And that was just a simple idea that he ended up seeing my brother making model airplanes and so forth, and, thought it wouldn't be funny if I dressed Snoopy up as a World War I flying ace. And you try it once and you get the response, and then your imagination starts to run with it, and all of a sudden the thing went on and on and on. It was the best thing you ever thought of. Yeah, well, 50 years is kind of amazing. I mean, who would have thought when you do a TV special for 26 minutes, it's going to be around 50 years later? I don't think anyone ever thinks of that. But I think it's more than that for me now that since his passing and since I've been involved with the business and doing the movie, when you travel around the world and you meet the people, and you really see that, the true honest passion and love for peanuts is astounding to me, because you can be in the farthest away regions of the planet and you'll see Snoopy's, and it touches someone somewhere, some child, some mother, and so forth. I was at our local air show just yesterday, and this one girl that's flying the biplane in the air show wanted to meet me, and she has a Snoopy sitting in the front of her cockpit that her husband put in there in 2007. She said, I never fly without Snoopy along. And Snoopy's there doing all the aerobatics and stuff with this girl that absolutely loves Snoopy. And, we hear stories, and real emotional stories. People have called my dad up and said, hey, can I use Snoopy on the tombstone of my daughter that died, because she loves Snoopy? And it's really powerful.